Hi, everyone. So welcome to the 2021 Humanities for the Public Good Symposium panel titled Feedback Now. We're excited for today's conversation and to field questions afterwards. So please, if you have any questions kind of during the presentation, feel free to pop them in the chat, and then we'll have a section at the end to kind of address any things that arise. So in case you aren't already aware, our host this week is Humanities for the Public Good, which is an Andrew W. Mellon funded initiative that works to connect scholars and communities within and beyond UNC Chapel Hill. Before we get started, though, we feel it's important as stewards of public engagement to acknowledge that the Triangle overlaps with the historic territories of the Siouan, Iroquoian, and Algonquin indigenous communities. In Durham, I am currently on land historically belonging to the Occaneechi Band of the Zaponi Nation, and today their descendants belong to sovereign nations that continue to resist systematic erasure. Let us honor them whose land we are on, their ancestors, and the enslaved peoples whose exploited labor and being accumulated the wealth and laid the foundation of this university. In the book Dancing on Our Turtles' Backs, Ojibwe scholar Leanne Beta-Samosake Simpson describes the importance of foundation stories for Indigenous cultural resurgence. She argues that storytelling can become a lens through which we envision our way out of cognitive imperialism and experience spaces of freedom and justice. However, in order to practice this storytelling, we need to cultivate collective models that embrace audiences. A model where the line between storyteller and audience becomes blurred. I think the sentiment leads us well into today's conversation about feedback, the Institute for Performance. And so in today's conversation, we're excited to welcome a couple of special guests who will be discussing feedback. We'll have a Q&A with these guests, and then we'll transition to a Q&A with the audience. Hold on one sec. Okay. So the guests joining me today are Melanie Kamathi, the Creative Futures Idea Harmonist at Carolina Performing Arts and PhD candidate in communication. Dr. Lauren DiGiulio, Mellon Postdoctoral Fellow at Carolina Performing Arts, and Dr. Amanda Graham, Associate Director of Engagement at Carolina Performing Arts. So I'm gonna hand it off to Amanda, who's going to introduce what kind of feedback is, where it came from, and really kind of ground our discussion.
Thank you, Imrat. Thank you to everybody at Humanities for the Public Good. We're really happy to be here today to talk a little bit about this initiative. So Feedback is a performance institute. It's a new performance institute through Carolina Performing Arts. And it was created this summer, really. Well, I've got a dog, and she needs to be let out of the room. 1 second.
So I think what Amanda was getting at was feedback was started over the summer. And okay, well, she's back, so.
It's very quick. Thank you. Feedback was started over the summer, and we were looking for a way during COVID to bring together faculty members and artists, which is something that we do quite frequently at Carolina Performing Arts, both through our touring artists meeting with faculty members and students on campus, and then also our artists in residence, which Lauren will talk a little bit more about, many of whom are funded through our Mellon grants, our Mellon initiatives. And so how to do this during a time of COVID when people aren't traveling and we're not having live performances in our venues. One of the things I really value about Carolina Performing Arts is because we believe in performers and artists work as a form of scholarship, and that we think about, their approach to process, the way that they create, the way that they reflect, as making, as producing knowledge as a form of knowledge production. And this is something that I wanted to continue, even though we had moved to the virtual world of Zoom. I also had a number of conversations with our faculty advisory committee for CPA, and they were all very enthusiastic about continuing conversations with artists that they'd already started or investing in artists that they were keen to get to know. And so how to do this? We decided to create a series of online classes. And these classes, we believe, would best serve the public. You know, many people, of course, are home right now and in front of their computers, and folks that would normally come to our public engagement events aren't able to do that. So we wanted to open this up to the general public. So we had an open application for anybody who lives in the Triangle, and advertised on social media. We just really wanted a diverse group of folks to bring together audience members who would normally go to Memorial Hall with those who would go to an avant-garde dance performance in Current, and to have them in the same Zoom classroom in conversation with an artist maybe they've never heard of before, or maybe they're deeply invested in. And so we did that, and we were really inspired by one of our artists in residence, Okwe Okpakwasili, who took part in one of our feedback sessions to think about the relationship between the audience and the performer. As she says, as you can see on the screen right there, she aims to generate a kind of radical intimacy in her performances, an empathy, an empathetic stream, an empathetic feedback loop. And so that's why it's called Feedback, the Institute for Performance, is after Okwe's quote there, that we think that, performance itself doesn't happen on the stage or in the audience. It happens somewhere in between, in the feelings that arise, the affect, the conversation, the whisperings, the energy in the room. And that's what we hope for with feedback. And I think that, for the most part, what we've done. And so we had 2 classes in the fall that were co-hosted by choreographer Faye Driscoll, who is an artist that we have a long-term relationship with at CPA. And they focused on liveness. That was class number 1, and then on arts economies. And people say, well, what is liveness? Well, that's exactly the question that I posed to the professors and the artists that presented. I said, well, what does liveness mean to you? Does that mean being embodied, being in a room with somebody? Does that mean focusing on absence during this time of COVID? Liveness can mean any number of things, scholarly or otherwise, just kind of an everyday conversation. And so the series of classes on liveness focused on, what it means to be together, how we defined performance, a whole variety of things, what it means to be in community. And then the arts economies classes were just that. They were more of a pragmatic dive into both local and national arts economies, thinking about, what the arts need now in order to have a scaffolding that's going to take them through COVID and beyond. Also talking to some artists that are, would argue that the arts are having a moment of reckoning right now, and that things need to change, and that things are changing, and that we can learn a lot from not having the arts for a year or more of our lives. So we were joined by artists, by faculty members who were in conversation with one another around these subjects. Lauren's going to speak more about how we paired them. And we were joined by a small group of folks from the public. And we had conversations about ideas. And I think one of the goals was just to create relationships in this time where we feel very isolated. And I think that happened, that our audience members got to know one another, our artists got to know our faculty members, so that when these artists are on campus with us again, they have a colleague in the classroom who will introduce them to their students and the other members of their department. And then we also have a group of folks that are going to be excited to meet in person the artists that they previously met on the screen the next time a performance comes through CPA. So certainly relationship building was a goal. The other thing that Zoom allowed was just accessibility. So people, who maybe don't normally come to campus because of parking, for instance, were able to get on Zoom and to join us from their homes. So that was also a goal of feedback. So I'm going to turn it over to Lauren, who's going to talk a little bit more about how this idea came about when we took our Mellon grant Distill kind of to its next level. So Lauren, it's all you.
Thank you, Amanda, and thank you to the Humanities for the Public Good. Thanks to Ashley Meltzer and Amrit Mishra for organizing this panel. It's great to be able to just kind of reflect on what we learned, what we're continuing to learn, and how we can take these ideas into the future. I think that we did feel that it was a sort of experimental platform that we were creating, and an extension of our engagement initiatives in terms of taking these conversations that would normally happen on campus or in a certain kind of space within a venue or a classroom, and really bringing it into conversation with the larger public. So the initiative essentially was kind of grew out of years-long Mellon Foundation grants that CPA had received and is still in the process of working with. I, as the postdoctoral fellow at CPA, I manage the Discovery Through Iterative Learning grant, which is a grant called Distill, which invited 4 artists to be in residence at on UNC's campus over the course of 2 to 3 years. So they were really embedding themselves within the fabric of life within the campus and creating relationships, particularly with faculty members, building a kind of dialogue between their own artistic research practices and the academic research practices of these faculty members. And to have this sustained dialogue then essentially transitioned into the dialogue that artists were interested in having with different kinds of community members and community groups. So with our model for Distill, we then entered into a new grant through the Mellon Foundation called Creative Futures, which Melly has also been working with. And we have 3 artists through Creative Futures that we're working with, or rather 4 artists who are particularly concerned with creating dialogue with community members and thinking about the ways that their artistic practices are linked to those. So we've kind of created these essentially concentric circles models of engagement that have really opened the campus up into dialogue with the public in a variety of ways. And so Okwi Akpakwesili is one of our Creative Futures residents, artists in residence. And so we were kind of taking her cue as well and thinking about the significance of feedback and dialogue and listening and exchanging and thinking about engagement as a real, a kind of dialogue, listening as important as speaking. And so that model kind of became something that we wanted to explore in feedback. And so Amanda and I, as co-curators of this experience, really started thinking about what kinds of relationships we wanted to develop between artists and UNC faculty members. Most of the artists and faculty had not met before, or were kind of just working together for their first time. So we began with thinking about artists that at CPA we had long-term relationships with. So we asked Faye Driscoll, a choreographer with whom we're working on a new commission, to essentially host all of these sessions as a facilitator. And then we invited different sets of artists paired with UNC faculty members from various departments to essentially create a kind of lesson plan together where they could dialogue and then open up their discussions to all of the participants from the public who were with us through the sessions. And I'm going to take you through now just the different all of these sessions, we had 6 sessions in our course on liveness. And the artists and faculty were really thinking about different aspects of liveness. We gave them a little bit of guidance, but really let them dialogue together and sort of collaborate in terms of thinking about how they were going to shape their conversation. And when we were thinking about making these pairings, we were thinking less about sort of how their research and practices kind of lined up on a kind of one-to-one level, and really we're thinking about different kinds of methodologies and approaches to their work rather than the content of the work itself. So we were really thinking about the kinds of relationships that could be built and have, in certain cases also continued beyond the course of the classes themselves. So we did start with artists who we had a relationship with. So Annie B. Parson is the choreographer and artist for a company called Big Dance Theater that has been presented at CPA many times, and we're working with her on a new commission. We decided to pair her with Associate Professor of American Studies, Michelle Rodriguez, who works on different kinds of film archives, and they looked at actually, I'm going to go back because we're going to look at clips. So I'm going to just talk a little bit about how Faye worked with us and led the class essentially in different kinds of somatic movement practices, and really thought about liveness as a kind of embodied practice, where she was really looking at how we could kind of be together, all of the participants, through our screens. So we could play that clip.
Between your hands and your brain. Feeling how your hands touch and grab tools all day long for communication. Feeling all the tools.
It looks like there's a little bit of trouble playing the clip, but that's okay.
Okay. Well, I could just say what it was. So she was leading the class in thinking about looking at our hands, looking at the different things in our room and naming them.
Between your hands and your brain. Feeling how your hands touch and grab tools all day long for communication. Feeling all the tools that your hands touch, and how those tools touch your brain, how the brain then moves the hands to touch the tools. All those you've touched, all those who have touched you.
Okay, so I think we can go back. Thanks, Amrit. So she began the course with essentially helping us think about how different embodied practices could help us create a certain kind of presence among ourselves and how we connect through the screen. The second course was, or the session within liveness was choreographer Annie B. Parson and Associate Professor Michelle Robinson. Apologies that I mispronounced her name earlier, Michelle Robinson. And their session was on, essentially they talked about correspondences and thinking about the hand and the body and how that liveness comes when you're writing. Dr. Robinson has a new project where she's looking at different kinds of letters and correspondences made to the Reverend Billy Graham, and Annie B had talked about she had written some things about sort of the choreography of how you're walking in the street during the age of COVID. So we can play that clip.
Zoom is a new poetic form. It's like a geometric box form, and it has this sort of confessional, perhaps confessional Chekhovian subconscious of the chat that we're playing with today. And TikTok, that's like a folk dance form, a micro folk dance form, I would say. And all this is unfolding in real time. What all this means. Well, Twitter has 280 characters, I think. So it's a short form soapbox, like a rant form. And it disappears. It doesn't, you can keep it, but it also has a quality of something that's not supposed to be kept. Instagram, that's the theater of images.
Okay, so
and
I
email,
think we can
it's
move.
Replaced the letter.
We can move on. Thank you, Amrit. And our next, in that clip, you saw Annie B talking about the different kinds of social media forms as a kind of different kinds of media, and thinking about writing and sharing in these different kinds of spaces. And so our third session was with artist Okwi Akpakwasili and Associate Professor of Art History, Carrie Levine. And during this session, they talked about Okwi's practice where she's working with collaborators, and she's asking everyone to kind of do a slow walking meditation and then writing about their experience to kind of create a collective song together, even through the screen. So if we could play that clip.
Sonic creation between artists and members of the public. And all of it sort of revolves around the question of what do you carry and how in turn does that carry you? And so that was the question we sent. And we also, my partner has made a kind of sound score so that you can do a slow, I mean, maybe it could be likened to a meditation, but spend some time in a kind of contemplative posture with this sound, reverberating with the question and the sound. And then afterwards, just writing in a way that is both grounded in your body and experience, but then can start to move to far-flung places, images, you know. So.
Okay, so that we can move forward. Thank you, Amrit. So you just saw Okwi talking about describing this practice that we participated in together. And normally she's staging these practices in public ways. So this was what we were doing together on Zoom. We had a session where the choreographer Brendan Fernandez worked with Associate Professor of Music, Andrea Bowman, and they talked about how public space can be a kind of place of resistance, of cultural resistance, where different kinds of bodies can kind of move against normative, hegemonic strictures. And they played a clip from a queer Polish artist named Zemilska, an electronic soundtrack, and Brendan talked about his practice and different kinds of choreography in public space. And so they had a discussion around sound and reverberation and how it related to the body. So we could play that clip.
I think there was something interesting, you know, something really jarring about having like these words in front of my eyes as I was listening, because I felt like it was like invitations, actually not dissimilar to like being on the dance floor and having someone extend their body's response to music or to sound or space to you. And it really, like, this time reading through today, I just kept cherishing this sentence. There are no new ideas, there are only new ways of making them felt. Seemed like such a wonderful, I don't know, Brendan, if you thought that was like a little bit in tension with of the like really forward momentum. I don't know, maybe it's not in tension with the Munoz, but it makes me think about how in electronic tracks like this, or like the whole job of a DJ commanding a night, is supposed to, like, you know, a lot of your words are like filling the space, about hugeness, about submitting your body. Yeah, that part of it is that we know it's going to climax somehow, right? So there's this kind of like almost sexual energy to this. I mean, there is sexual energy that's inscribed into the music world. I don't know if you think about that when you're working with DJs.
Yeah, definitely. And a lot of my work is I work with DJs because and also, you know, I was so excited to work with you, and I think Amanda brought us together because, you know, you work in sound and I work in like movement, but like, you know, the two need to be together. You know, sometimes I challenge my answers in the most subtle way where I make them, and they'll say I'm cruel to them because I don't give them any sound. And you know, so even like listening to this piece,
Okay, I think we can
it made me
move
feel
forward.
hopeful. It made me.
So the last session that we had between an artist and a UNC faculty member was we paired Associate Professor of Communication Tony Perucci with Tommy Noonan from Culture Mill, the group Culture Mill, which is based in here in Saxapahaw. And again, we're also working with them. We are working with them right now on our new feedback endeavor, our new course this spring, which we can also talk about a little bit later, about audience advocates. So we're actually working with them on a new piece that they're doing, and they're working with our participants. So I want to just pass it along to Melly right now. That's sort of a description of what we were actually doing during the course sessions.
Thank you, Lauren, and thanks everyone. I'll just echo all of the thanks that were given earlier to everyone who has made this panel possible, as well as the feedback, you know, the world of feedback that's been created that we've been describing for you, and as well, all of the wonderful work that Carolina Performing Arts is doing, just bringing various artists into conversation with campus and community through, you know, feedback and distill and all of the different initiatives, Creative Futures. So what I wanted to talk about specifically is something that you've heard each participant thus far mention in different ways, but the way that each of us come to feedback and what we are bringing with us as we participate just operates on so many levels. And so for me, I am a graduate student at UNC in the Department of Communication, focusing on performance studies. And we heard Amanda say a little bit about performance earlier, but the world of performance studies is one of being able to hold space and interact with what's happening in that space in many different ways, intentional and otherwise. And so as I, you know, was already working with Carolina Performing Arts as sort of a liaison between the Creative Futures artists in residence and other parties on campus, as well as teaching courses in the Department of Communication as an instructor, as well as conducting my own research, which actually focuses a great deal on the concept of liveness. And then I came across the New Feedback Institute over the summer in the midst of COVID and all of the uncertainties and all of the rapid transitions that everyone was having to make. For me, just a designated space to think about liveness while working through liveness in the ways that we're capable of doing, or especially earlier in the pandemic this summer when the Feedback Institute took place. I thought I need to be part of this, and I wasn't sure, where do I fit in, because the class was advertised as open to the general public, available on Zoom. And so I thought to myself, well, I'm kind of not the general public because I am affiliated with both Carolina Performing Arts and the university in other contexts. But at the same time, I am a bridge between all of these worlds because I also see performances and am quite interested in and related to various artists. And I also saw the potential of being able to bring all of this awareness into my teaching. And so I asked if I could join the liveness session, and Amanda welcomed me. And so I participated in the 6 sessions live on Zoom of feedback. Of the liveness, and I actually also participated in the 6 sessions of the arts economies cluster of courses. It's so hard to talk about this because there's institutes and sessions and courses and lots of different layers. But just just to kind of spell it out for anyone who's not so familiar, liveness was one sort of suite of courses, and that's the one you've been seeing clips of. But there is also the arts economies suite, where that was the main topic, that you can go to YouTube and actually watch. Anyone can access them at the Carolina Performing Arts YouTube page. And because that access exists publicly now of the live classes, I decided that as a live participant in the liveness classes, I would then breathe additional life into the operation by incorporating the videos of the liveness courses, which are available on YouTube, into my current teaching in the spring semester. So I am teaching a class on I'm teaching a class on cultural diversity. And as we heard Amanda and Lauren mention in regard to pairing artists and scholars for the benefit of the Feedback Institute, diversity was certainly a direct consideration in creating the classes. And so as I was prepping to teach a cultural diversity class from the performance lens that I'm already bringing because of the work that I do, I thought, what better text to introduce, among the other texts that we're using in the class, than this series of live videos where each participant in the video is not only now grappling with contending with the COVID scenarios that we've all been adapting to over the past, now more than a year. At the time, it was pretty fresh. Why not bring this forward to current students as an artifact? So I am, just by steering them in this direction, now these videos get to be live again, or live in a new way, with new live participants watching a recorded live video, and incorporating all of the impetuses, the various impetuses, whether it's the artists' goals of their practices and the adaptations that they're having to make in real time to continue their work as well as maintain their livelihood through COVID, to the scholars who have never, not necessarily interacted with working artists in the classroom, but now are trying that on with the participants from around the community in various locales. I can recall members of my classes being working in other sorts of arts professions in the area, maybe not as the primary artist on the stage, but in some, artist support positions. I can recall people who are who are medical professionals, who are arts patrons and really just wanted to engage in these conversations. People who are public school teachers or work in other sorts of public service sorts of occupations, all coming into this space to interact. And so for me, it was about multiple publics giving their feedback and receiving their feedback in the now of that moment. And since we are all co-creating a life through a pandemic with all of the emotions and the technologies that brings up, it is instructive for everyone, regardless of their position within um, within the entire world of performance and liveness and the university and art and society. So I want to make sure I'm not rambling on too long. Is there more time for me to discuss my involvement and what's happening in the class, or should we?
Yeah, well, so I was gonna transition us into questions, but the first question I have is directed to you, Millie.
Oh, great.
And so I was actually wondering, like, first off, thank you everyone for detailing your experiences with feedback. I love that we have so many different perspectives. For Melly, one thing that I was wondering is, in that kind of move from taking the class to teaching the class, did anything speak to you differently? Like, was there a different experience with feedback? And if so, like, what was that?
Well, a different experience with feedback. Well, feedback for me, I guess I really have come to, there has been a growth in how I'm thinking about feedback. So for me, feedback is, it's about relationships, as Lauren and Amanda were saying in the beginning. It's a reaction in some cases. You know, it's that noise that just comes from, you know, electronic waves interfering, which is a metaphor for what happens in real life. Oftentimes, when you have people coming from different, you know, perspectives or backgrounds or opinions, and then suddenly they're in the same space, they're taking up space together, and they're maybe clashing. Feedback is also necessary. It is how we relate in society. We can't connect if there's not an exchange, a constant exchange that's going. So for me, especially given, you know, the Zoom landscape, and even what Annie B was saying in her clip earlier about how each of these platforms and each of these, you know, technological mediations that we're using creates a whole different like stage or landscape or space that we have to interact with and through. So all of that is definitely impacting the way that I'm bringing this and presenting it to students for them to then interact.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I think that for me, feedback too is about like that space that's created. And it's something that it's hard to actually make and to secure. And then once you have it, what do you do with it? And that kind of brings me to my second question for you, Lauren. And I was wondering, how do you see kind of funding of the arts and arts education going forward to actually like cultivate these spaces where we can be together and kind of talk and share with one another? And do you think that large grants, like the ones that allowed for feedback to happen, can effectively serve communities if we're looking beyond just like the university itself?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that it's actually a really exciting time for arts and education engagement. I think there are ways that, you know, we've for so long, and the sort of default has been thinking about having these conversations within the space of a campus or the space of a kind of closed community. And we are now at a point where I think also the COVID has also really accelerated this in terms of thinking about how we've shifted into an online format for so many of our programs and public conversations, that we are, I think the space of conversation with the public is a very, very exciting and you know, a high growth space. I believe that the future of these kinds of large grants to support initiatives like Distill, Creative Futures, and Feedback is very bright. We are seeing right now many large grant-making organizations really committing large amounts of funding specifically to arts and engagement initiatives, initiatives that are interested in social justice, that are interested in restorative justice practices, climate justice, and thinking about how the arts and humanities and higher education really impacts the sort of greater good, the greater public. The markets have also done well in the past year, and so I think grant-making organizations are now also in a position where they can make these grants and this funding. And so I think that it's frankly a very exciting time in a landscape that sometimes I think can or has felt a little bit, a little bit more challenging within the past year. And I think these kinds of initiatives also create space within institutions like CPA or UNC to kind of be like incubators or kind of research and development units where ideas can really be tested out, can think about measuring impact, and then potentially integrating some of what the outcomes have been into a more integrated programming that the institution will potentially, incorporate in their activities moving forward. So I sort of see it as being something that is really going to continue into the future.
Mm-hmm. I think that language of kind of experimentation and what grants can allow us to do is really like from a outsider and then insider perspective with feedback, I think has really stuck with me. And kind of given that the foundations for feedback have been laid, Amanda, I was wondering like what visions does CPA or do you in particular have for feedback going forward and what future iterations might look like?
Yeah, I would just stress what Melanie was saying before, that that all of these sessions are available on our YouTube channel. And so certainly they're available to professors and lecturers for pedagogical purposes to use in their own classrooms, to artists who are interested in doing research. But they're for everybody. So that is one thing that you can do right now if you'd like to learn more about what's going on with feedback, is just check out those videos. Right now, we have a class going on, Amrit, that you're involved with, that is called Audience Advocates. And it's, after we did these sessions that were more thematically based about putting professors and artists in conversation with one another, we were prepared to start thinking about the CPA's future with performance and start rolling out the carpet for next year, which we hope would be a live year. And all signs are pointing to the fact that it most likely will be, if a little bit more conservative in our programming. I was interested in thinking about how this audience that we had developed through liveness and arts economies might travel with us, and asking others to kind of join along the way, that they would return and work with artists who, again, we have relationships with, who we anticipated would be on our future seasons, to develop new works. And so we have a class right now that is being facilitated by first Faye Driscoll. We had 4 sessions with Faye, the choreographer who joined us, that you saw there in that brief video clip, who is working on a new untitled piece for New York Live Arts that's about consent and relationships and connection in this time of not touching one another. And then we're also working with, as Lauren mentioned, Tommy Noonan and Muriel Elazion from Culture Mill, based in Saxe-Bahal, so more locally, who have a piece that is really participant-driven installation work that is going to happen through CPA next year, titled Eclipse. And so both of these works are in the early research phases. So what better time to get feedback from audience members to help you build your pieces, to come into the laboratory with you and to kind of take part in those experiments. And it's going really well. I mean, I'm enjoying the classes that are happening right now. We're asked to do all of these embodied activities, really invest in these artists' approaches, so that when these pieces do come to CPA, the participants in the room can attend them and know one another and know these artists and understand how these works of performance were built. And so we're planning next year to continue with audience advocates in Zoom, in a Zoom world, at least for the fall. And we have artists that are interested in developing new works and also revising old pieces. So our website will be updated with the opportunity to register for audience advocates in the fall. And yeah, that's audience advocates is exactly what it sounds like, and that we hope for a group of diverse audience members who will advocate for these artists and their works. And in turn, we hope that our artists are listening to our audience members even as they are making their works, and that this is a place for process, a place for creation. So that's what's happening with the Feedback Institute right now, but I look forward to seeing how it will grow in the future as well. I think there's a lot of exciting things coming up.
Thank you. So I believe we have time for about like one more question, and this is a question kind of open to anyone who wants to answer. But since a large part of feedback is about kind of trying to cultivate community, question, what does community mean? How does it look like? And how do we use the arts for that? What key priorities should cultural institutions or universities focus on to foster dialogue, support, and care for the artists in their communities? And I can also repeat that. I know I tend to speak a little quickly, so.
Well, I would say one thing that we can do is recognize that, although CPA, for instance, is an organization that has internationally touring artists come through our stages all the time, I think we have really focused more on locally based artists in the last few years. For instance, the Commons Festival that happened digitally this year and in person a couple of years ago is a festival that is entirely comprised of locally based artists. I think that that building an infrastructure of artists and arts writers, of art scholars, of community members that are arts invested, of bringing people together in those conversations is really important. So I guess my short answer to that is thinking about how building a local network of artists and arts interested folks then influences our international relationships, our international artist relationships. I also, one of the things I don't believe in, is just kind of like the straight up class visit. I think it's kind of like a transactional thing. I've said this, I think, to all of you at some point, where an artist goes into a classroom and nobody knows who they are or why they're there. And I think that experiences like feedback and kind of experiences that are premised on deep engagement rather than broad engagement make folks a lot more invested in the relationships with the artist, because it's not just a relationship with the work, it's a relationship with a person.
For me, something that has come up in both my direct work liaising between artists and the rest of the university community with Creative Futures, and also participating in the feedback classes, is the importance of identifying a space where creativity is necessary and permitted and essential. I think oftentimes when we're doing academic work, creativity has some boundaries that are not necessarily even stated. We have, institutional structures that such as, for example, the Zoom box. I think one of the things that Faye and several of our presenters took the opportunity to do is to recognize that, hey, we are all in our own spaces, and really we always are, but now let's bring our own spaces and what it means for us to be in them to the work. So let's stand up, let's move our bodies, but also conversations about Amanda mentioned consent earlier in one of I think it's Annie B's forthcoming work, but just how do we come to consensus? How do we give each other permission? How do we agree? Those are some of the questions that have been coming up for me lately through it was okay. Yeah, so just I'm sorry. Just utilizing the liveness and the creativity to think about how we do these things that have become habitual in academic spaces, and how can we further adapt them to a place where everyone's needs and methods can equally reside.
I wholeheartedly agree with that, Melly. And I would also say that I think conversations with artists help us kind of break down the siloed nature of the academy. You know, it's very hard, I think, when one is like working within a university structure, to even sometimes go across the campus or go into a different department or leave the campus and have conversations. And I think that's something that I've noticed with our artists in residence is that they help to break down those silos and to get people even within the university to start talking to one another. And everyone benefits from that work. We've, you know, there's really measurable impact on, you know, the faculty research and work and outlook in those cases, as well as the artistic practice. And I would also emphasize what Amanda said about these long-term relationships and creating infrastructure. I think the idea of a kind of long-form conversation, or a conversation that's really kind of just about understanding what it means to have a long-term partnership, and cultivating a dialogue that's not just like a one, you know, one and done, that's actually really about exchange and that is about building something together, is very important. And kind of going in between these different spaces and using different spaces in ways that maybe they weren't even intended to be used, or that they can be brought together via some of these conversations is crucial.
All right, well, thank you all so much. I think that's about all we have time for. Yeah. I want to kind of reiterate what everyone has said here in terms of the utility and usefulness of feedback. So personally, I sat in on like virtual feedback sessions in terms of I saw the classes after the fact on YouTube. I've been a little bit behind the scenes. Now I'm taking a feedback session. And there's just so much to be learned about watching conversations happen in a form that they often don't happen, right? So it's like conversations across so many different lines of like the artist, the professor, the just people who are interested in art. And when you have all those people in the same space, you don't have the same talk that most of us are used to. And so I think that's been really interesting to witness. For anyone else who also wants to kind of get in on feedback, the classes are available on YouTube, as we've mentioned a couple of times, and just kind of be on the lookout for the upcoming sessions when they're announced. Well,
thank you, Amrit. And
thank you, Amrit.
and Melly and Amanda.